Welcome to Boring Pastimes. Tonight, we begin another long journey into the quieter corners of history, told slowly and without haste. This is not the story of battles or heroes sung in triumph, but of details often overlooked, the routines, the silences, and the slow turning of time. Our subject is Theodora, a woman whose path led from the shadows of Constantinople's streets to the glittering seat of the Byzantine throne. Her life was shaped not only by ambition, but also by survival, patience, and the ordinary struggles of a world far removed from our own. Across these stories, we will wander through her beginnings, her rise to power, her role in diplomacy, and her lasting legacy. Each step will be taken carefully, with attention to the details that so often slip through the cracks of grand history. So settle in. Let the words carry you at a gentle pace. This is history told not for urgency, but for rest. This is Theodora, from Brothel woman to the Byzantine throne, told as only boring history can be. Story 1. The early years of Theodora. You begin your journey in the city of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire in the early 6th century. The streets are a labyrinth of stone and dirt, with uneven cobblestones underfoot, lined by modest dwellings and the occasional imposing structure of imperial architecture. Life here is a mixture of grandeur and grit, where public baths, open markets, and church plazas teem with the rhythms of everyday existence. You can almost hear the low hum of merchants calling out their wares, the distant chime of church bells, and the occasional bray of a donkey laden with goods. This is the world into which Theodora was born, a world of contrast, immense imperial wealth next to pervasive poverty, religious devotion shadowed by political intrigue. Theodora's family background was far from prestigious. Her father, Acacius, was reportedly a bear trainer for the hippodrome, a man who worked with exotic animals in one of the city's most vibrant entertainment arenas. Her mother, perhaps known as a mime or a stage performer, contributed to a household where the lines between survival and performance often blurred. Life for Theodora's family was precarious. A single illness, accident, or bad performance could mean the difference between having enough food for the week and going hungry. As you imagine this household, note the subtle rhythms of survival, the careful allocation of scraps of food, the constant attentiveness to the needs of their patrons and the authorities, and the skillful navigation of social hierarchies that existed even among entertainers and trainers. From her earliest years, Theodora would have observed the subtle complexities of human behavior. People in her neighborhood were accustomed to negotiation and persuasion. You would see mothers haggling at the marketplace for fresh fish or grain, fathers bargaining for apprenticeships or jobs, and children navigating both play and petty mischief. These daily experiences, seemingly ordinary and repetitive, were actually formative lessons in social acuity, observation, and adaptation skills that Theodora would later rely upon in the imperial court. Education in her household would have been limited, especially for girls. Formal schooling was rare, especially for someone of Theodora's social standing. Instead, knowledge came from observation and participation. She would have learned to read expressions, anticipate reactions, and recognize the subtle signals of power and authority. Perhaps she listened closely when her mother recited lines from a play or mimed stories of gods and heroes. Even these small entertainments carried the weight of cultural literacy in Constantinople. Myths, moral lessons, and social norms embedded in the performance. Every gesture, every word, was a lesson in the human condition. The city itself imposed a rhythm of survival that could not be ignored. Constantinople was crowded, with narrow alleyways and bustling squares, where smells of cooking, waste, and animals combined in a potent olfactory mosaic. Water was drawn from wells or aqueduct-fed fountains, and daily hygiene routines were dictated more by availability than comfort. Disease was a constant companion, and the very architecture of the city, tightly packed homes, open sewage channels, and poorly ventilated interiors exposed its inhabitants to recurring illness. In such conditions, children learned resilience early, developing adaptability and caution as a matter of necessity. Theodora's family likely faced constant economic instability. Payments for performances could be delayed or withheld, and patronage was unpredictable. This created a household culture in which resourcefulness was essential. Perhaps young Theodora learned to make her own clothing from scraps, to barter for necessities, or to entertain visitors with small tricks and performances. These were not trivial skills. They were early exercises in negotiation, persuasion, and the manipulation of appearances, all tools that would later serve her in navigating the Byzantine court. Religious life also permeated the city. The church, an omnipresent institution, offered both solace and social expectation. Families prayed for health, protection, and favor, and festivals punctuated the calendar with both ritual and opportunity for commerce and social interaction. Even for those living at the margins of wealth and influence, these religious rhythms structured daily life. For Theodora, exposure to the rituals, chants, and ceremonies of the church likely contributed to a nuanced understanding of belief, power, and public spectacle. You can imagine her attending services, absorbing the chants, the incense, the grand architecture, and perhaps noting how the clergy wielded influence over both the faithful and the powerful. As Theodora grew, she would have observed the limitations imposed upon women of her class. Opportunities were few, autonomy was constrained, and survival often depended on aligning oneself with the right patrons or benefactors. Yet, within these constraints, she learned to navigate. Perhaps she witnessed her mother charm or cajole, turn a misfortune into advantage, or maintain dignity in the face of public scrutiny. These small, repetitive lessons were crucial. The ability to read people, to measure ambition, to gauge when to yield or assert oneself. It is easy to overlook such details, but in a society structured around hierarchy, every glance, every whispered word, and every gesture carried significance. In these early years, entertainment offered both escape and opportunity. The theaters of Constantinople were alive with performers, mimes, dancers, acrobats, and animal trainers. Here, young Theodora could see the interplay between skill, presentation, and audience reception. She learned that people were drawn to spectacle, that charisma could command attention, and that cleverness could elevate even those of humble origin. These observations were far from trivial. They constituted a practical education in human psychology and social leverage, forming the foundation of her future political acumen. Beyond the performance spaces, Theodora's neighborhood itself was a school of resilience. Markets, streets, and courtyards were filled with challenges: the risk of theft, the threat of disease, the daily struggle to secure food and shelter. She would have seen neighbors negotiating conflicts, mediating disputes, and finding ingenious ways to survive. In these mundane realities, she absorbed lessons about justice, pragmatism, and human motivation. Such observations were less flashy than battlefields or imperial ceremonies, but they were no less critical in shaping her understanding of the world at this point. It is worth considering that Theodora's early life, though far removed from palaces and imperial intrigue, laid the groundwork for the remarkable person she would become. The constant negotiation of survival, the keen observation of human behavior, and the subtle accumulation of social knowledge were forming within her a capacity for influence and leadership. By the time she reached adolescence, these lessons would be second nature, enabling her to navigate more complex social structures and ultimately prepare her for encounters with the imperial elite. Yet, despite these formative experiences, questions remained about how she would transcend her circumstances. How would a girl born into such precarious conditions, surrounded by the mundane struggles of daily survival, come to command the attention and respect of one of the most powerful men in the Byzantine Empire? How would the lessons of cobblestone streets, crowded theaters, and modest homes translate into the corridors of imperial power? It is a puzzle that begins in these ordinary streets, suggesting that even the most mundane details of life can harbor the seeds of extraordinary change. As Theodora moved from childhood into adolescence, the rhythms of Constantinople's streets and stages became even more central to her life. The city's theatrical culture, while often looked down upon by moralists, offered practical training in observation, communication, and influence. Mimes, dancers, and actors performed not only for amusement, but also as part of civic and religious festivals, for the imperial court, and for the bustling marketplaces. Theodora, like many girls of her social standing, found herself drawn into this world, learning its routines and rituals with careful attention. Daily life for a young performer was rigorous and repetitive. Rehearsals demanded physical endurance, long hours of movement, vocal projection, and precise timing. Lines and gestures were memorized, repeated, and refined. Mistakes were public, and the audience's response immediate. Every performance offered subtle lessons in human behavior, which gestures captivated attention, which expressions elicited sympathy, and how social hierarchies influenced audience reactions. For Theodora, these lessons were not mere entertainment. They were the foundation of social acuity. She learned to read an audience as easily as one might read a friend or a rival, noting who wielded influence and who remained powerless. Beyond the stage, the streets themselves were classrooms. Vendors, beggars, soldiers, and artisans all intersected in the crowded thoroughfares. A single day could involve navigating arguments over space in the marketplace, observing the interactions of guilds, or overhearing political gossip that would ripple through neighborhoods and courts alike. In these seemingly mundane exchanges, Theodora honed her ability to discern truth from pretense. She began to understand the delicate balance of trust and caution necessary to survive in a city where appearances often masked intention. The profession of a performer carried a social stigma, particularly for women. actresses, and entertainers were often associated with sexual availability, and the line between performing and prostitution was frequently blurred by contemporary commentators. While modern historians debate the extent to which this labeling was fair, in practical terms, Theodora had to navigate a world in which her gender and profession made her vulnerable. This required strategic thinking, knowing when to speak, when to smile, and when to avoid attention altogether. Her ability to balance charm with self-preservation became increasingly vital. Financial stability was fragile. Patronage could shift overnight, depending on the whims of influential spectators or the fortunes of the imperial household. Theodora would have been familiar with the constant calculation required to maintain her position, providing enough entertainment to satisfy patrons while avoiding overt dependence, presenting herself as valuable without overstepping social boundaries, and learning the unspoken rules that governed interactions with those more powerful. Every exchange was a small negotiation, every favor a subtle assertion of her own worth. The theatrical world also introduced Theodora to networks of information. Theaters and entertainment circles were hubs where news and rumors flowed freely, often faster than official channels. She would have learned which rumors were significant, which whispers could be leveraged, and which stories posed threats. These were not trivial skills. They were early lessons in political literacy. Understanding the motivations and tendencies of those around her prepared her for the far more consequential negotiations she would later encounter at court. Despite the challenges, the environment offered occasional rewards and small triumphs. Successful performances brought recognition, small gifts, or temporary patronage. Theodora may have witnessed the fleeting admiration of an influential figure or the tangible benefits of being remembered favorably. These experiences, though minor in the broader sweep of history, reinforce the link between skill, visibility, and survival. It was a lesson that would echo through her life. Influence is built gradually. With attention to detail, patience, and adaptability, it is likely that during this period, Theodora began to understand the power of personal presentation. Clothing, gestures, and even subtle facial expressions could alter perception. She would have seen how a well-timed laugh, a carefully chosen accessory, or a particular posture could command respect or attract favor. Such lessons were learned through meticulous observation and repeated trial, a form of social apprenticeship. Over time, these small refinements coalesced into a nuanced awareness of personal influence, preparing her for encounters far beyond the theatrical stage. Life outside the theater also demanded resourcefulness. Food, lodging, and clothing were obtained through negotiation, work, or exchange. Illness, theft, and occasional violence were ever-present threats. Theodora's early exposure to these risks cultivated resilience. She learned when to take risks and when to exercise caution, skills that would later prove invaluable in the treacherous environment of the imperial court. Survival here required not brute strength but subtle intelligence, an ability to navigate complexity with calm pragmatism. The social environment of Constantinople further complicated matters. Gender roles were strict, but fluidity existed in practice, especially in entertainment circles. Young women like Theodora had to balance societal expectations with their own ambitions. negotiating their visibility without attracting punitive scrutiny. Here, she may have encountered mentors or allies, other women who taught practical lessons about survival, persuasion, and the dynamics of male-dominated spaces. These relationships, though often informal, formed the scaffolding of social intelligence that she would later employ at the highest levels of power. Religion continued to shape daily experience. The Church's moral expectations often intersected uneasily with the realities of theatrical life. While the stage offered freedom of expression, it was also subject to moral scrutiny. Theodora would have learned to navigate these tensions, presenting herself in ways that minimized censure while maximizing opportunity. She may have attended services or observed rituals, not only as spiritual practice, but as a study in authority, symbolism, and public perception. Understanding how institutional power operated, even indirectly, added another layer to her growing political literacy. In addition, Constantinople's physical environment reinforced lessons in patience and endurance. Streets were crowded, sanitation poor, and the climate demanding. Daily navigation required awareness, planning, and adaptability. Even minor inconveniences, rain turning dirt paths to mud, a street blocked by construction, or the sudden presence of soldiers necessitated quick thinking. These mundane challenges built a form of practical intelligence, emphasizing problem-solving and foresight in ways that formal education rarely could. Theodora's adolescence, therefore, was a careful cultivation of skills that extended far beyond performance. She absorbed lessons in social strategy, risk assessment, persuasion, and resilience, saw through the ordinary experiences of daily life. Each interaction, each performance, and each negotiation contributed to a growing repository of practical knowledge about human behavior. It is important to recognize that these lessons, while unglamorous, were foundational to her later achievements. The ability to observe, anticipate, and influence others is often invisible in historical records, but it is no less consequential than battlefield heroics or political decrees. Yet, even as Theodora's abilities grew, the question of her future remained uncertain. The streets of Constantinople were unforgiving, and many young women in her position failed to rise beyond obscurity or hardship. How would she transition from this precarious life of performance and survival to the rarefied and treacherous world of the imperial court? What encounters, decisions, or circumstances would open the path from the modest stages of the city to the corridors of power? The story of her ascent was still unwritten, leaving the possibilities open, waiting to unfold. By the time Theodora reached young adulthood, she had already accumulated a wealth of experience in navigating the precarious spaces of Constantinople. The lessons of stage, street, and survival had given her a keen understanding of human behavior, an intuition for power, and a calm pragmatism that few could match. Yet, the question remained, how would these skills translate into real influence, particularly in a world as stratified and treacherous as the Byzantine imperial court? The answer began to emerge in a series of encounters with a man whose life and ambitions were soon to intertwine irrevocably with her own Justinian. The future emperor, Justinian, at this time was not yet emperor, but was a prominent member of the imperial family, known for his ambition, intellect, and political acumen. He had already begun to cultivate a presence in the imperial administration, navigating the complex networks of advisors, officials, and court factions that determined the workings of the empire. Unlike Theodora, Justinian's early life was comparatively sheltered. He moved in circles of elite education, formal training, and aristocratic expectation. Yet, even he required a partner capable of understanding not just courtly ritual, but the subtleties of influence that extended into the broader social fabric of Constantinople. A partner who could navigate both public and private spheres with intelligence and discretion. Theodora and Justinian's paths crossed, likely in the world of performance and entertainment, a space that blurred the boundaries of social classes more than most others. While the historical record offers only fragments and anecdotes, it is clear that Theodora's presence was striking enough to capture the attention of one of the empire's rising figures. She did not simply charm, she observed, calculated, and engaged. Her ability to balance visibility with discretion made her both intriguing and safe as a companion in the eyes of those with influence. Every gesture, glance, and word would have been measured, a product of years of subtle social apprenticeship. Their initial interactions were likely mundane by the standards of historical legend. Conversations in private chambers, shared attendance at performances, or mutual presence at civic or religious events. Yet, within these ordinary interactions, Theodora's skills were on display. She had learned to maintain composure in the presence of authority, to signal intelligence without arrogance, and to demonstrate loyalty while preserving autonomy. These qualities distinguished her from others who might have relied solely on beauty or charm, and they signaled the potential for a partnership that could extend beyond the ordinary expectations of social connection. Theodora's reputation, even at this stage, was already complex. While some may have labeled her according to the biases of the time linking her profession with immorality, others recognized the depth of her intellect and the practical wisdom she exhibited. Within the Byzantine court, perception was everything. The ability to inspire respect, cultivate influence, and navigate gossip was essential for survival. Theodora had already mastered these subtle arts in her adolescence, and now they found an audience that could amplify their effect. For Justinian, Theodora represented more than personal attraction. She offered insight into the lives of those beyond the aristocracy, a window into the social realities of the city he was destined to govern. Her experiences in navigating precarious social hierarchies, reading human intentions, and managing perception provided her with a form of practical intelligence that complemented Justinian's formal training. In a world dominated by advisors, generals, and bureaucrats, such insights were invaluable. Theodora's knowledge of the streets, the stage, and the subtle mechanics of influence positioned her not just as a companion, but as a potential strategic partner. As their relationship developed, Theodora began to exercise influence in subtle ways. She would have recognized the importance of timing, when to speak, when to remain silent, when to offer counsel, and when to observe. These actions, seemingly minor, had outsized effects within a court that prized discretion and foresight. By maintaining a balance between accessibility and autonomy, she cultivated trust without dependence, a skill that would become critical in her later life. The broader political and social context also framed their relationship. Constantinople in this period was marked by factional disputes, administrative complexity, and ongoing threats, both internal and external. Leaders required partners who could provide not only loyalty but insight into the motivations and behaviors of others. Theodora's early years had been an extended apprenticeship in precisely these dynamics. Her understanding of human behavior, her capacity for calm judgment under pressure, and her skill in negotiation all converged at this moment, creating conditions for her unprecedented ascent. Even as Theodora began her journey into the circles of power, the path ahead remained uncertain. Court life was treacherous, alliances were fragile, and reputations could be destroyed by rumor or misstep. Every interaction required calculation and attentiveness. With Theodora's skills honed in the theaters and streets of Constantinople, could she transform her understanding of ordinary life into influence over an empire? These questions, unresolved at this stage, set the stage for the next chapter of her life, in which Theodora would begin to exercise real agency within the Byzantine court, laying the groundwork for her eventual role as empress. In reflection, the first stage of Theodora's life, her childhood in a modest household, her adolescence as a performer, and her initial encounter with Justinian potential hidden within ordinary circumstances, the skills that may have seemed mundane or necessary for survival, the observation of behavior, the careful negotiation of social hierarchies, the cultivation of composure would become instruments of power in ways few could predict. History, in its often slow and seemingly mundane unfolding, had prepared her for a role that would influence the Byzantine Empire for decades, beginning with the unassuming yet pivotal meetings that connected her path with Justinian's. Having captured the attention of Justinian, Theodora entered a new world, one defined by ritual, hierarchy, and the persistent tension between visibility and discretion. The imperial court of Constantinople was a stage far larger and more complex than the theaters of her youth. Here, every gesture was observed, every word recorded, and every interaction weighed for potential consequences. For someone like Theodora, whose early life had trained her to navigate precarious circumstances, this world offered both peril and opportunity. The architecture of power in Constantinople was intricate. Palaces, administrative halls, and ceremonial chambers were designed not merely for comfort, but to reinforce social hierarchies. Entrance to these spaces was tightly controlled. Courtiers, officials, and attendants moved in highly structured patterns. Even the choice of entrance, the timing of arrival, and the arrangement of one's clothing conveyed status. For Theodora, observing these patterns was a continuation of lessons learned on the streets, noting who held authority, who deferred, and how influence circulated in subtle, often invisible channels. Daily life in the court was filled with routines that might appear mundane, but were critical to survival and influence. Ceremonial appearances, the exchange of formal greetings, attendance at religious services, and the observance of protocol all demanded attention. A misstep could have social consequences, even if it seemed trivial. An incorrectly folded garment, a slightly delayed bow, or a misplaced word could diminish reputation. Theodora, accustomed to balancing visibility with discretion, quickly adapted. She understood that power often resided in the details, in the ordinary acts of appearance, behavior, and attentiveness. Theodora's early interactions with other court members revealed the importance of alliances. Courtiers included seasoned officials, military leaders, advisors, and women with long-established influence. Each had their own ambitions and networks, and navigating these required a combination of observation, subtle persuasion, and careful discretion. Theodora's experience in entertainment had taught her to read audiences, gauge reactions, and respond appropriately, a skill now repurposed for social strategy rather than performance. She learned whom to approach, when to remain silent, and how to demonstrate competence without threatening established hierarchies. One of her first challenges was understanding the implicit rules of patronage and loyalty. The court operated on a network of favors, obligations, and unspoken expectations. Wealth and position were often less important than perception, reputation, and strategic alignment. Theodora likely observed and participated in small exchanges of influence, offering counsel, assisting with information gathering, or providing support in ways that were not formally recognized but were noticed and remembered. In these actions, her earlier lessons in negotiation, observation, and subtle performance found immediate application. Religious ritual remained central. Attendance at imperial chapels, participation in festivals, and engagement with clergy reinforced not only personal piety but also social positioning. Theodora would have learned which ceremonies mattered most to influential figures, how to convey devotion without ostentation, and how to observe the interplay between spiritual authority and political power. The subtle acquisition of favor through religious presence complemented her social maneuvering, creating a multi-dimensional approach to influence. Daily survival in the palace required practical intelligence as well. Food, living arrangements, and personal security were mediated through both formal staff and informal networks. Theodora's early exposure to resourcefulness became invaluable. She learned to navigate household hierarchies, anticipate needs, and cultivate reliability. Reliability, it turned out, was a form of social currency. Being perceived as trustworthy allowed her to move more freely, observe more keenly, and gradually expand her influence in a space where suspicion could easily isolate newcomers. Interaction with Justinian became increasingly strategic. Their conversations, initially informal, evolved into exchanges with practical significance. She began to offer insight into public sentiment, social dynamics, and the perspectives of those beyond the aristocracy. In doing so, Theodora provided a type of intelligence that was difficult to obtain through formal channels. The observations of someone who had lived, worked, and survived among ordinary citizens, performers, and marginalized groups. Her ability to translate these experiences into actionable counsel demonstrated foresight and discernment, yet her rise was not unopposed. Court politics were fraught with envy, rivalry, and suspicion. Established courtiers sometimes viewed newcomers, particularly women, as threats to their influence. Theodora had to navigate these tensions carefully, maintaining visibility with Justinian while avoiding the perception of overreach. She developed a balance between assertiveness and discretion. These lessons were not theoretical. They were learned through daily negotiation and constant vigilance. The material culture of the court also demanded attention. Clothing, jewelry, and presentation were not merely decorative. They communicated social information. Theodora learned which colors, fabrics, and adornments signaled affiliation, status, or prudence. Even small details, the folding of a garment, the placement of a piece of jewelry, or the timing of a greeting could alter perceptions. Mastery of these nuances, combined with her understanding of human behavior, allowed her to cultivate a persona that balanced charm, intelligence, and subtle authority. At this stage, Theodora began to exercise influence in small but meaningful ways. She offered advice, mediated minor disputes, and demonstrated insight into the needs and desires of those around her. Each of these actions, though seemingly ordinary, reinforced her reliability, intelligence, and strategic presence. She was building a foundation for greater authority, laying the groundwork for a more pronounced role in governance and decision-making. Her early years in the court also reveal the subtle accumulation of political literacy. She learned to anticipate the consequences of actions, to read unspoken hierarchies, and to understand how loyalty and obligation circulated within the palace. Her experience in performance and street survival had taught her observation, adaptability, and calculation. Now, these skills were applied to the complexities of imperial power. The difference lay not in the nature of the skills themselves, but in the scale and stakes of their application. Yet, even as her influence began to grow, questions remained about how far she could rise. Could a woman who had spent her formative years navigating the streets and theaters truly command authority in a court dominated by centuries of tradition and male privilege? Would her practical intelligence and strategic acumen suffice to secure lasting influence? Or would she remain constrained by perception and societal expectations? These uncertainties created a tension that would define the next phase of her life, a period in which opportunity, crisis, and decisive action would intersect to reveal her capacity for extraordinary leadership. In observing Theodora at this stage, one sees the quiet power of preparation, patience, and the mundane details of skillful living. Her story illustrates that influence often begins not with dramatic gestures, but with consistent, thoughtful action. Understanding people, navigating hierarchies, and exercising judgment in ordinary circumstances. History, in this instance, is shaped as much by subtle awareness and strategic observation as by overt conquest or authority. By this stage, Theodora was no longer a newcomer to the imperial court. She had established herself as a figure whose presence commanded attention and whose counsel was quietly valued. Yet, while recognition had grown, the Byzantine court remained a complex and often perilous environment. Influence was never static. It required continuous navigation of shifting allegiances, rivalries, and subtle power plays. For Theodora, the stakes were higher than ever, and her survival depended on the careful application of lessons learned. Throughout her early life, the day-to-day routines of court life continued to shape her strategic approach. Ceremonial appearances, feasts, and processions offered opportunities to observe the interactions of influential figures. Courtiers, generals, and administrators each exhibited predictable patterns of behavior, often revealing ambition, insecurity, or loyalty in subtle ways. Theodora's ability to read these cues, honed during years of theatrical observation and street survival allowed her to anticipate tensions before they escalated. Every gesture, every tone of voice, every delayed bow or slight frown was a piece of information to be carefully catalogued and considered. Her proximity to Justinian provided a platform for influence, but it also required constant vigilance. While their relationship was built on trust and shared understanding, it existed within a network of scrutiny. Advisors and courtiers monitored interactions for signs of favoritism, manipulation, or political threat. Theodora needed to balance assertiveness with discretion, ensuring that her counsel was recognized without provoking jealousy or suspicion. Here, subtlety was paramount. She could not rely on overt power. Her skill lay in influencing decisions indirectly, shaping outcomes while remaining formally peripheral. One of her earliest demonstrations of strategic acumen involved mediating minor conflicts within the court. Disputes between officials, competition for appointments, or disagreements over ceremonial precedents could escalate into factional rivalries. Theodora learned to intervene judiciously, offering advice or support in ways that diffused tension without appearing overbearing. These actions earned her a reputation for intelligence, tact, and reliability. She became known as someone who could be trusted to navigate complexity, a perception that further increased her informal influence. Theodora also began to engage with issues beyond the palace walls, cultivating awareness of broader social and political dynamics. The Byzantine Empire was vast and diverse, and the sentiments of merchants, soldiers, and ordinary citizens could ripple back to the capital in unexpected ways. By observing and understanding these currents, Theodora provided Justinian with insights that were difficult to acquire through formal channels. Her earlier experiences in the streets and theaters of Constantinople gave her a unique perspective. She could interpret public mood, anticipate potential unrest, and advise on policy in a manner grounded in lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Religious and ceremonial life continued to serve as both a constraint and a tool. Participation in rituals was expected, yet these events also provided subtle opportunities for influence. Theodora learned when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to present herself in ways that signaled intelligence, piety, and reliability. By understanding the symbolism and hierarchy embedded in these rituals, she could navigate the court with both visibility and discretion, projecting authority while remaining formally within the expected bounds of female participation. During this period, the threat of rivalry was constant. Established courtiers, wary of a newcomer gaining influence, sometimes attempted to undermine her. Gossip, subtle exclusion from ceremonies, or the withholding of information were common tactics. Theodora's response was measured. She did not react impulsively or confrontationally, but rather observed, documented, and recalibrated her approach. In doing so, she turned potential vulnerabilities into opportunities to demonstrate patience, intelligence, and strategic foresight. Every slight or obstacle became a chance to refine her understanding of court. Politics, practical skills from her early life also proved indispensable. Resourcefulness, negotiation, and careful attention to detail allowed her to navigate palace logistics and household dynamics with efficiency. She understood which staff, advisors, or officials could be allies, and how to cultivate relationships that reinforced her position without provoking resentment. These everyday competencies, which might appear mundane, were essential to consolidating influence in an environment where the smallest misstep could be magnified into scandal or loss of favor at the same time. Theodora's ability to influence Justinian became increasingly apparent. Her counsel, framed with clarity and pragmatism, often anticipated the consequences of proposed actions or highlighted overlooked factors. She provided a perspective that was both grounded in practical reality and attuned to human behavior, a combination that complemented Justinian's own formal training and ambition. Her contributions, though informal and largely behind the scenes, began to shape decisions in meaningful ways. The broader political environment also tested her skills. Byzantium faced internal administrative challenges, factional rivalries, and the constant need to balance the interests of powerful generals, officials, and aristocrats. Decisions regarding appointments, taxation, and religious policy required subtle negotiation and careful timing. Theodora's insights, informed by observation and practical intelligence, helped navigate these challenges. She began to understand the levers of power not as abstract concepts but as tangible instruments that could be influenced through skillful observation, strategic counsel, and careful action. By now, Theodora's presence in the court was no longer peripheral. She had carved a space for herself, one defined not by overt authority, but by reliable counsel, strategic insight, and the cultivation of relationships. Her influence was subtle but tangible, and her reputation as intelligent, observant, and tactful spread within the palace. Yet, even as she gained recognition, the potential for crisis remained ever present. Court life, by its nature, was volatile, and the next significant challenge could arise from any quarter: a rival faction, an unexpected death, or a sudden outbreak of unrest in the city or empire. Theodora's early court experience, then, illustrates a critical lesson about influence. It is rarely immediate or dramatic. It is built gradually through observation, patience, careful action, and strategic awareness. Each interaction, each decision, and each small demonstration of skill contributed to the accumulation of authority that could later be exercised decisively. The ordinary details of routine attendance at rituals, mediation of disputes, and subtle negotiation of relationships became instruments of power, demonstrating that mastery of mundane circumstances often precedes extraordinary achievement. Yet, as her influence grew, the question of her capacity to act decisively in moments of crisis loomed. Would her skills, honed in observation and subtle maneuvering, suffice when confronted with threats that required boldness and courage? How would she transition from strategic advisor to a figure capable of shaping the course of the empire itself? These unresolved questions foreshadowed the challenges that would soon define her legacy. As events unfolded that demanded not only intelligence and tact, but decisive action and courage under pressure. By the time Theodora had fully navigated the routines and hierarchies of the Byzantine court, she had amassed a reputation that was quietly formidable. Her influence over Justinian, her keen perception of courtly dynamics, and her ability to negotiate complex social networks all converged at a moment when the empire itself teetered on the brink of instability. The first significant political crises of her early court life would test her judgment, patience, and strategic capacity, revealing the depth of her skill and foreshadowing the extraordinary role she would eventually assume. The Byzantine court in this period was an arena of subtle conflict as much as overt politics. Rival factions competed for influence over policy, appointments, and access to the emperor. Advisors and generals were not merely colleagues, but actors in a constant struggle for precedence and favor. For Theodora, navigating these dynamics required careful observation and calculated intervention. Misreading a gesture or responding prematurely to rumor could result in a loss of standing or worse, the alienation of powerful allies. Yet, every subtle maneuver she executed strengthened her reputation as someone capable of managing complexity and exercising discretion with intelligence. One of the earliest crises involved disputes over appointments and the allocation of administrative responsibilities. Generals, bureaucrats, and officials each sought to consolidate their influence, often by undermining rivals or exploiting the emperor's uncertainties. Theodora's role, initially informal, involved mediating these disputes and offering insight to Justinian regarding personalities, loyalties, and the likely outcomes of various courses of action. Her counsel, rooted in observation and practical reasoning, often anticipated consequences that others failed to foresee. Through these interventions, she subtly guided decision-making without drawing undue attention to herself, demonstrating both prudence and acumen. Religious and social tensions further complicated the environment. The Byzantine Empire was characterized by a delicate balance among various factions of the church, aristocracy, and provincial leadership. Policy decisions regarding taxation, religious enforcement, or civic projects could inflame factions or provoke unrest. Theodora's understanding of popular sentiment derived from her earlier life among performers, merchants, and ordinary citizens, provided Justinian with an invaluable perspective. She recognized the importance of balancing justice, perception, and pragmatism, advising in ways that mitigated potential unrest while enhancing the emperor's authority. Theodora's consolidation of influence was not without resistance. Courtiers who viewed her ascent with suspicion attempted subtle measures to discredit her or limit her access to the emperor. Rumor, minor exclusion from ceremonies, and insinuation were common tools. Yet Theodora's response was consistent with the lessons of her youth. She observed, recorded, and adapted. She did not react impulsively, but rather allowed others' attempts to reveal themselves over time, turning potential threats into opportunities to demonstrate patience, insight, and strategic intelligence. Each challenge refined her understanding of power, highlighting the importance of timing, perception, and subtle maneuvering. By now, Theodora's strategic approach had begun to manifest in more tangible forms. She advised Justinian not only on courtly disputes, but also on governance, civil administration, and social policy. Her counsel reflected an understanding of human behavior, practical realities, and the unintended consequences of decisions. She could anticipate resistance, recognize opportunities, and propose solutions that balanced multiple interests. The accumulation of this informal authority positioned her to act decisively when the empire faced more acute crises, an ability that would soon be tested on a scale unprecedented. In her life, daily life continued to demand attention to detail. Courtiers watched for errors, ceremonial missteps, or lapses in etiquette. Small details, correct posture, timely gestures, and appropriate speech remained crucial. Theodora's mastery of these subtleties reinforced her credibility, allowing her influence to grow quietly but steadily. Her experience in performance and street survival, where observation and adaptation were essential, now found full expression in the palace, demonstrating that ordinary skills applied with intelligence can have extraordinary consequences. During this period, the challenges Theodora faced were less about immediate physical danger and more about the risk of miscalculation. The court was a web of alliances, favors, and obligations, in which one misstep could cascade into scandal or loss of trust. Theodora's approach was methodical. She observed, she analyzed, she tested, and she acted only when she had accumulated sufficient understanding of both the individuals involved and the broader consequences of action. It was a form of strategic patience, one that distinguished her from others who relied on ambition, charm, or impulsive decision-making. The culmination of these early crises demonstrated her growing capacity to exercise influence decisively. When disputes escalated to the point of threatening imperial authority, Theodora's counsel was instrumental in guiding responses that balanced firmness with diplomacy. She did not act for personal gain, but rather through strategic insight, reinforcing her reputation as a prudent and capable advisor. Her interventions stabilized conflicts, mitigated potential unrest, and subtly positioned her as indispensable to Justinian's understanding of both court and empire. By the end of this stage, Theodora's influence had become tangible, yet still carefully managed. She had carved out a role that combined discretion with authority, observation with intervention, and patience with strategic action. The skills cultivated in her early life of observation, negotiation, adaptability, and the nuanced reading of human behavior had been transformed into instruments of political power. Her presence, while formally informal, was increasingly felt across the court, marking the first stage of her transition from performer and observer to active participant in the governance of an empire. Yet, even with these early successes, uncertainty remained. Theodora's ascent, though steady, had yet to confront the most dramatic tests of her ability to act decisively in moments of acute danger. How would she respond when the stakes were not subtle disputes, but life or death crises? Could her accumulated skill, patience, and insight withstand the pressures of open rebellion, widespread unrest, or the volatility of imperial ambition? These questions, unresolved at this stage, would soon define the next phase of her life, setting the scene for the extraordinary intersection of crisis, courage, and influence that would solidify her place in history. By the time Theodora and Justinian had established a stable courtly relationship, their partnership had already begun to shape the future of the Byzantine Empire. This was not a story of sudden ascent or dramatic heroics. Rather, it was the gradual accumulation of influence, trust, and strategic collaboration. Theodora's skills, honed from childhood in Constantinople's streets and theaters, and refined in the subtleties of court life, now found their ultimate application. Life in the imperial court was defined by constant observation and careful management of relationships. Every meeting, ceremony, and interaction carried both symbolic and practical significance. Justinian, ambitious and intelligent, recognized the value of a partner who could navigate these complexities with skill and subtlety. Theodora, for her part, had learned that influence was rarely exercised overtly. It required a combination of visibility, discretion, and strategic timing. Together, they formed a partnership in which each complemented the other. Justinian's formal authority, paired with Theodora's practical intelligence and understanding of human behavior. Daily routines in the palace were extensive. Audiences, administrative sessions, religious observances, and public appearances occupied much of the day. Theodora's role, while informal in title, was deeply embedded in these routines. She observed how officials, generals, and clergy interacted, noting patterns of loyalty, rivalry, and ambition. Every ceremonial procession or ritual provided insights into human behavior, who deferred, who asserted, and who maneuvered subtly to enhance their standing. In these ordinary events, Theodora's earlier lessons in observation and adaptation proved invaluable. The court's political environment was one of continuous tension. Advisors vied for influence, factions competed over appointments, and rumor spread rapidly. Theodora's ability to read these undercurrents allowed her to anticipate potential conflicts and advise Justinian on prudent courses of action. Her interventions were measured, subtle suggestions, carefully timed observations, and discreet counseling. These actions rarely drew public attention, but were instrumental in shaping outcomes behind the scenes. Religious life continued to intersect with political authority. Imperial patronage of churches, monasteries, and clergy required careful management, as missteps could provoke factional opposition or popular discontent. Theodora's understanding of human behavior and social dynamics extended to this sphere as well. She recognized that religious and political authority were intertwined, and that influence could be exercised through subtle mediation, patronage, and counsel. Her observations of rituals, festivals, and clerical hierarchy informed her advice, allowing Justinian to navigate these complex intersections more effectively. Theodora's early influence also involved mediation within the court. Disputes between officials, competing factions, or rival family interests could destabilize the palace if left unchecked. Theodora learned to intervene with tact, diffusing tensions without asserting overt authority. Her reputation for prudence and reliability grew steadily, demonstrating that influence often accrues through subtle, consistent action rather than dramatic gestures. These interventions reinforced her indispensability to Justinian and slowly positioned her as a central figure in the decision-making processes of the empire, financial and logistical. Matters of the palace further demonstrated Theodora's practical skill. Resource management, allocation of household duties, and coordination of staff required attention to detail and the ability to anticipate problems. Theodora's early life of resourcefulness, managing scarce household resources, and navigating precarious survival translated seamlessly into these tasks. Her competence in mundane yet essential matters reinforced the perception of her intelligence and reliability, further consolidating her influence. As Theodora's role grew, she began to cultivate a broader perspective on the empire. She observed the lives of ordinary citizens, the functioning of markets, and the impact of imperial policies on social stability. Her experiences outside the palace among performers, merchants, and the city's marginalized populations provided unique insight into public sentiment. She could anticipate the consequences of unpopular policies, gauge the mood of the populace, and advise on measures that balanced authority with public satisfaction. This perspective distinguished her from many courtiers who were confined to the formalities of palace life, making her advice particularly valuable to Justinian. The early stages of their partnership also revealed the subtle power of collaboration. While Justinian held formal authority, Theodora's counsel shaped his decisions in ways that were both strategic and prudent. She guided him in anticipating resistance, managing factions, and understanding human motivations beyond the written law. Their interactions were not public declarations of influence, but careful, deliberate exchanges that gradually shaped governance. The partnership was built on trust, mutual respect, and the recognition of complementary skills. Yet, as the partnership strengthened, the empire faced tensions that would test both their judgment and resolve. Factional rivalries, administrative disputes, and emerging unrest threatened stability. It became increasingly clear that influence alone, subtle observation, and counsel might not suffice in the face of crisis. Theodora's accumulated skills and strategic awareness were about to be tested on a scale larger than any courtly dispute or administrative challenge at this stage. The story of Theodora and Justinian is defined by preparation, observation, and the gradual accumulation of power. Ordinary routines, ceremonies, counsel, mediation, and careful attention to details served as the foundation for influence that could be decisive in moments of crisis. The mundane aspects of court life, often overlooked in historical narratives, were precisely the spaces in which Theodora's capacity for leadership and judgment were honed. Yet questions lingered, unresolved, even as she gained recognition and influence. Would the subtleties of courtly maneuvering suffice in the face of popular unrest? Could Theodora translate observation, prudence, and counsel into decisive action when the empire itself was threatened? These uncertainties set the stage for the next chapter of her life, in which her combination of intelligence, courage, and strategic insight would be tested against one of the most dramatic crises in Byzantine history, the Nika Revolt. The year was 530 CE, and Constantinople was simmering with tension. Long-standing grievances among the populace, coupled with factional disputes in the imperial chariot racing teams, the Blues and the Greens, had erupted into violent unrest. Riots filled the streets, buildings burned, and the emperor's authority was openly challenged. In this environment of chaos, the stability of the empire itself was at stake. Justinian, despite his intelligence and ambition, faced uncertainty. The forces of mob fury and political ambition threatened to overwhelm him. It was in this moment that Theodora's insight, courage, and strategic acumen became decisive. The Nika Revolt was not merely a riot. It was a convergence of social, political, and economic tensions that had accumulated over years. Taxation policies, unpopular officials, and simmering resentment among the populace created a combustible situation. The chariot factions, which had long served as a form of social organization and urban identity, became the focal point of dissent. When a dispute during races escalated, it ignited long-suppressed grievances, turning Constantinople's streets into a battlefield. Fires consumed structures, including portions of the Hagia Sophia and other important buildings, while crowds chanted demands for the overthrow of Justinian. For the emperor, the crisis posed a dual threat: the physical danger of the mob and the political danger of betrayal by courtiers or military leaders. Many advisors counseled flight, urging Justinian to abandon the palace and flee to safer regions of the empire. From a practical standpoint, withdrawal seemed reasonable. The capital was overwhelmed, and the loyalty of troops could not be guaranteed. It was here that Theodora's presence proved pivotal. Theodora's advice was both bold and strategic. She rejected the notion of flight, recognizing that abandonment of the capital would be interpreted as weakness and could permanently undermine imperial authority. Instead, she urged Justinian to assert control, consolidate loyal forces, and respond decisively to the revolt. Her counsel emphasized not brute force alone, but the importance of perception, morale, and the demonstration of resolve. In doing so, she reframed the crisis from one defined by fear to one demanding calculated action. Her influence during these critical hours illustrated the unique combination of qualities that had prepared her for leadership. The lessons of observation, strategic patience, and understanding of human behavior honed in the theaters, streets, and early court life were applied at the highest stakes. She recognized that the loyalty of generals, the courage of soldiers, and the perception of the populace were intertwined. Her guidance helped shape the plan that would ultimately suppress the revolt without a collapse of imperial authority. Theodora also demonstrated a rare quality for a figure of her background: courage under direct threat. Reports suggest that she addressed the possibility of fleeing versus standing firm with a forthright and unwavering stance, reportedly asserting that she preferred to die an empress rather than live in exile. Whether anecdotal or factual, this moment illustrates the psychological component of leadership, inspiring resolve in the face of imminent danger. Her determination reinforced Justinian's own courage, solidifying the partnership that had been quietly developing over years. The suppression of the Nika revolt required both military strategy and psychological insight. Theodora's counsel informed decisions regarding troop deployment, the coordination of palace defenses, and the timing of the decisive assault against the insurgents. Her understanding of human behavior, the crowd's psychology, the factions, rivalries, and the loyalty of commanders was critical in predicting reactions and orchestrating the empire's response. Without such insight, the revolt might have succeeded, changing the course of Byzantine history. In the aftermath, thousands of insurgents were killed, and order was restored. The Nika revolt left much of the city in ruins, but the emperor's authority remained intact. Justinian's position was strengthened, but the true significance of the episode lay in the role Theodora played. She had transformed from a behind-the-scenes counselor into an essential participant in decisions of empire. Her ability to combine observation, counsel, and courage under pressure demonstrated that influence, carefully cultivated over years, could become decisive in moments of crisis. The Nika revolt also underscored the interconnectedness of ordinary skills and extraordinary outcomes. Theodora's earlier life navigating precarious streets, performing before audiences, mediating minor disputes in court had prepared her for this moment. Skills that might have seemed mundane or trivial: judgment, observation, strategic patience, and negotiation proved instrumental in shaping the fate of an empire. Her influence was a product of accumulated experience applied at a critical historical juncture, revealing the quiet power of preparation and insight. Yet even as the revolt was suppressed, questions remained about the long-term consequences. How would the devastation of the city, the loss of life, and the exposure of imperial vulnerability affect Justinian's rule? Could Theodora's influence continue to expand without provoking resentment or opposition among courtiers and generals? The crisis had highlighted her capacity for decisive action, but sustaining influence in the aftermath of upheaval would require careful navigation, strategic foresight, and continued observation of the shifting political landscape. In this moment, Theodora's story illustrates a broader historical truth. The outcomes of events often depend not on grand proclamations or dramatic heroics alone, but on the subtle, accumulated skills of individuals who can act decisively when circumstances demand. Observation, judgment, courage, and strategic insight developed over years of ordinary experience can alter the trajectory of history in ways that may appear sudden but are rooted in long, deliberate preparation. The Nika Revolt, therefore, was both a literal and symbolic turning point. It revealed the fragility of imperial power, the volatility of urban populations, and the critical importance of judgment and courage. For Theodora, it marked the moment when years of observation, patience, and strategic skill were tested in a crisis with life-or-death stakes, proving that her influence extended far beyond counsel into the realm of decisive action. The aftermath of the Nika Revolt left Constantinople scarred but stable, and Justinian's authority intact yet strengthened by the decisive action taken during the crisis. For Theodora, the events of the revolt marked a profound turning point. Her counsel, courage, and insight had been instrumental in preserving the throne, elevating her from a trusted advisor to a central figure in the governance of the empire. The subtle influence she had cultivated over years in the court now became formalized, shaping imperial policy and consolidating her role as empress. In the immediate aftermath, attention turned to reconstruction and reconciliation. The city had suffered extensive damage. Public buildings, private homes, and civic infrastructure were in ruins. Theodora's influence extended into the planning and oversight of these efforts. She advised Justinian on measures that would restore stability while projecting an image of imperial competence and benevolence. Her understanding of public sentiment, gathered from years of observing and navigating the lives of ordinary citizens, guided policies aimed at rebuilding trust and loyalty among Constantinople's populace. Theodora also played a central role in mediating the lingering factional tensions within the court. Many officials, generals, and advisors had tested loyalties during the revolt, and some harbored resentment at the decisive suppression of the insurgents. Theodora's ability to navigate these rivalries relied on her deep understanding of human behavior and social networks. She advised Justinian on appointments, promotions, and demotions in ways that maintained balance, rewarded loyalty, and minimized the risk of further conspiracies. Her strategic patience, honed over years in both performance and palace life, became critical in stabilizing the internal workings of the imperial administration beyond immediate political and administrative concerns. Theodora began to exert influence over broader social and legal policies. Her insights into the lives of women, marginalized populations, and the underprivileged informed reforms that would leave a lasting impact on Byzantine society. While historical records vary in detail, Theodora is credited with advocating for measures that protected women from exploitation, reformed marriage laws, and supported the welfare of the poor. These initiatives demonstrate her ability to transform personal insight and practical intelligence into systemic, institutional change, a remarkable achievement for any advisor, let alone a woman navigating a patriarchal imperial court. Her influence also extended to Justinian's legislative and administrative reforms, the codification of laws, efforts to streamline bureaucracy, and initiatives to standardize governance across the empire benefited from Theodora's counsel. She understood that law and policy were not merely instruments of authority, but also tools for shaping loyalty, managing dissent, and projecting stability. By advising on these measures, she positioned herself as an integral participant in governance, not merely as a peripheral consort. The consolidation of power required careful attention to perception as well as action. Theodora's public appearances, ceremonial participation, and management of courtly rituals reinforced her authority while maintaining legitimacy in the eyes of the elite and the populace. Her experience in performance balancing, visibility, presence, and subtlety allowed her to project influence without provoking overt resistance. She understood that power in the Byzantine court was as much a matter of perception as formal decree, and she leveraged this knowledge to secure her position. By this stage, Theodora's role had evolved from informal counselor to decisive political actor. Her accumulated skills, strategic observation, negotiation, judgment, and courage were now fully exercised in shaping imperial policy. Through the subtleties of court life, to a position where her decisions and counsel directly influenced the governance of the empire. Her influence was both practical and symbolic, a demonstration that intelligence, preparation, and courage could redefine the boundaries of authority in a world traditionally dominated by men. Yet consolidation of power was not without its challenges. Maintaining influence required ongoing vigilance. Rival factions, bureaucratic inertia, and external threats demanded continuous attention. Theodora's approach combined strategic patience with decisive intervention, ensuring that her influence remained effective without provoking unnecessary conflict. She demonstrated that true power often lies in the ability to act decisively while preserving stability, balancing risk and opportunity with skillful judgment. The story of Theodora's consolidation of power illustrates the broader principle that influence is cumulative. Skills developed in mundane or ordinary context, observation, social negotiation, understanding human behavior can become instruments of extraordinary impact when applied strategically over time. Her life shows that preparation, patience, and insight, combined with courage in moments of crisis, can alter the course of history in ways that might seem sudden but are, in fact, the result of long, deliberate cultivation in reflection. Theodora's rise after the Nika revolt highlights the interplay between personal skill, strategic insight, and historical circumstance. She transformed the lessons of her early life into instruments of governance, shaped the direction of the empire, and demonstrated the quiet yet profound impact of sustained, thoughtful action. Her story challenges assumptions about the sources of power and influence, showing that resilience, intelligence, and courage can redefine not only an individual's life, but also the course of history itself. The Byzantine court was a world of endless ceremony, ritual, and intrigue. Behind the glitter of mosaics, the incense of great processions, and the echoes of hymns in Hagia Sophia, there pulsed an intricate web of politics that demanded constant vigilance. To live at the heart of Constantinople was to be surrounded by ambition, rivalry, and the perpetual whisper of conspiracy. It was within this environment that Theodora found her place, no longer merely the empress by title, but an active participant in the machinery of power. Theodora's past experiences uniquely prepared her for this environment. Unlike most imperial consorts, she had not been raised in the sheltered luxury of aristocracy. She had known the sharp edges of poverty, the precarious life of performers, and the humiliation of being dismissed as unworthy by society's elite. These early lessons instilled in her an alertness that proved invaluable in court politics, where others might be blinded by ritual or lulled by ceremony. Theodora saw through the surface to the motives beneath. She could read the pause in a sentence, the hesitation in a bow, or the flicker of resentment in an advisor's eyes. In an empire where betrayal often gestured with a smile, this skill became a weapon as sharp as any sword. As Justinian's reign advanced, Theodora's presence in council meetings, private deliberations, and judicial decisions became increasingly pronounced. While Justinian wielded the formal authority, Theodora acted as his counterweight, questioning proposals, moderating impulses, and occasionally overturning decisions through her persistent counsel. Their partnership was not always harmonious. Theodora could be sharp, unyielding, and insistent, but it was productive. Justinian trusted her instincts, particularly where people were concerned. His legal mind could dissect laws and structures, but Theodora excelled in reading intentions and emotions, a complement that made their joint governance unusually effective. The Byzantine bureaucracy, vast and complex, provided another stage for Theodora's influence. Ministries and offices stretched across the empire, from tax collection to military command, each staffed by men eager for advancement or fearful of dismissal. Here Theodora's voice carried weight. She frequently intervened in appointments, favoring those she deemed loyal or competent, and blocking promotions of those suspected of disloyalty. Over time, her fingerprints were visible across the empire's administration, governors, generals, and court officials who owed their positions not only to Justinian's decree, but also to Theodora's approval. This intervention was not without controversy. Some resented the empress's power, whispering that a woman had no place in such decisions. Yet even her detractors acknowledged her effectiveness. Few dared challenge her openly, for Theodora was not one to forgive lightly. Once someone had proven untrustworthy or hostile, she remembered and acted accordingly. Her reputation for loyalty to allies and implacability toward enemies grew steadily, reinforcing both respect and fear. One of Theodora's greatest strengths in court politics was her ability to play the long game. She understood that not every slight required immediate response, and not every rival deserved open confrontation. Often, she allowed enemies to reveal themselves, waiting for the right moment to act decisively. When she did move against them, it was usually with quiet efficiency, a dismissal here, a reassignment there, sometimes exile, occasionally worse. Her actions were rarely impulsive. They carried the weight of calculation, leaving others to reflect on how thoroughly they had underestimated her patience and resolve. Theodora's skill at managing human networks extended beyond the palace itself. She cultivated relationships with clergy, advisors, military leaders, and even foreign envoys. Though Justinian remained the central figure in diplomacy and law, Theodora's counsel often influenced negotiations and reconciliations. Her input was subtle but steady, ensuring that the empire's dealings reflected not only Justinian's ambition, but also her keen sense of human dynamics. Yet, even as she maneuvered through the intricacies of politics, Theodora never abandoned her sense of the ordinary people who lived under imperial rule. Unlike many courtiers, she did not forget the hardships of women, laborers, or the poor. This perspective gave her a unique position in policy discussions. She could advocate for reforms not merely as abstractions, but as matters of lived experience. For her, the law was not only a tool of governance, but also a means of shaping lives and understanding that would soon translate into tangible reforms with lasting impact. Still, the court was not easily tamed. It remained a place of constant pressure, where loyalty could shift overnight and today's ally might become tomorrow's rival. Theodora's survival and success depended on her unrelenting watchfulness, her willingness to confront when necessary, and her refusal to allow complacency. Power in Byzantium was never secure. She laid the groundwork for reforms that would outlast her. But the question remained: how could a woman, in a society structured to exclude her from direct rule, transform influence into enduring change? Theodora's position within the Byzantine court was unusual enough. But what set her apart from most consorts of her era was the manner in which she used her influence. Many empresses before her had engaged in patronage, commissioning churches or supporting monasteries. Yet few had shaped the law of the empire in ways that directly touched daily life. Theodora's experiences growing up in hardship, performing in the theater, enduring humiliation, and later observing power at the highest level converged into a vision of reform. She understood that laws were not only a means of control, but also instruments of protection, and she used her influence to press Justinian toward policies that spoke for the vulnerable as much as the elite. The Byzantine legal system, deeply rooted in Roman tradition, had long reflected the assumptions of a patriarchal world. Marriage laws, inheritance practices, and rules surrounding labor and morality were heavily weighted in favor of men. Women were often treated as property, their social value tied to family honor rather than personal autonomy. For the poor, the law could be even harsher, punishing them for offenses born of necessity, while overlooking the abuses of the wealthy. Theodora, however, had lived these realities. She knew what it meant to be without protection, to live at the mercy of circumstance and the whims of those in power. Her reforms began with marriage and family law, pressing Justinian to introduce measures that gave women greater security. Divorce, once overwhelmingly in favor of men, was adjusted to allow women more grounds on which to leave abusive or neglectful husbands. Guardianship rules were softened, granting women a more independent role in managing their dowries and inheritance. These changes did not overturn the patriarchal system, but they offered tangible relief. Incremental steps that recognized women as participants in their own legal standing. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Theodora's reforms was her attention to the plight of women in the sex trade. In Constantinople, as in many great cities of the time, prostitution was widespread, a consequence of poverty, displacement, and lack of opportunity. Theodora, who had once lived among performers and women cast aside by society, understood both the vulnerabilities and the dangers they faced. Under her guidance, institutions were established to provide refuge and alternative paths for these women. The most famous of these was the convent-like refuge known as the House of Repentance, where women who sought to leave prostitution were given shelter, food, and the chance at a new life. Such measures were radical by the standards of her day. To the aristocracy, the plight of marginalized women was often invisible or irrelevant. For Theodora, however, it was personal. Her policies did not erase exploitation, but they acknowledged it, offering compassion where there had previously been only condemnation. In this, she displayed not only political insight, but also a form of empathy rare in imperial governance. Her reforms extended beyond women to other marginalized groups. She spoke for the poor in discussions of taxation, urging restraint in policies that might crush farmers or artisans. She argued for fairer treatment of individuals accused of crimes, insisting that punishment be tempered with consideration of circumstance. Even her interventions in church debates often reflected this instinct. She defended the rights of dissidents and exiles when others sought only to silence them. It is important to note, however, that Theodora's reforms were not purely altruistic. They also served a political purpose. By addressing the grievances of the poor, women, and the marginalized, she strengthened the empire's social fabric and deepened loyalty to the imperial family. Compassion and politics were intertwined, yet this does not diminish the significance of her achievements. It underscores her skill in aligning moral concern with practical governance. Critics, then and later, accused her of overstepping, of meddling in affairs unsuitable for a woman, of blurring the line between imperial authority and personal agenda. Some saw her compassion as weakness, others as a dangerous expansion of her power. Yet, whatever judgment was passed, her impact was undeniable. The laws of Byzantium, under Justinian's codification, bear traces of her influence, small but meaningful adjustments that shifted the empire, however slightly, toward a recognition of humanity beyond hierarchy. Still, every reform had limits. The structures of power were vast, deeply entrenched, and resistant to change. Theodora could not undo centuries of custom, nor did she attempt to overturn the patriarchal foundations of Byzantine society. Instead, she worked within the system, pushing boundaries where possible, securing improvements where resistance was weakest, and planting seeds of change that might take root in quieter ways. Her legacy in this sphere is one of pragmatism, choosing achievable reforms over impossible ideals, and in doing so, altering lives in ways that outlasted her reign. As she pressed forward with reforms, Theodora also deepened her reputation as an empress who did not shy away from the unpopular or uncomfortable. She could be stern, uncompromising, and even ruthless when faced with opposition. Yet, behind this hardness was a clear vision, a belief that empire was not only about conquest and ceremony, but also about the daily realities of those who lived beneath its shadow. But this raised a question that lingered throughout her reign. Could reforms driven by compassion and justice truly coexist with the cold machinery of power that defined the Byzantine state? Theodora's influence in the Byzantine Empire was marked by a duality that defined her reign. On one hand, she championed reforms that offered protection to the vulnerable, advocating laws and institutions that gave women and the poor greater security. On the other hand, she was capable of calculated ruthlessness, demonstrating a clear understanding that mercy alone could not preserve power in the Byzantine world. This balanced compassion, tempered by severity, was what allowed her to remain not only a figure of reform, but also one of stability in an empire where instability was the norm. Her reputation for ruthlessness often emerged in her handling of political enemies. The Byzantine court was a place where plots brewed daily, where generals might turn ambitions into rebellions, and officials might weave alliances to undercut imperial authority. Theodora knew well that her position as empress was unusual, and that her very presence in decision-making threatened traditional hierarchies. She understood that hesitation or leniency toward rivals could quickly be read as weakness when enemies revealed themselves. Theodora's response was decisive. Some were dismissed or exiled. Others met harsher fates. Historical records, often colored by the perspectives of her detractors, portray her as vindictive. Yet behind the accusations lay a consistent principle. Loyalty to the empire and to her vision of order had to be preserved, and betrayal could not be tolerated. Her actions were rarely impulsive. Instead, they reflected her preference for strategic patience, waiting for opponents to overreach before moving against them with a firmness that left little room for recovery. Ruthlessness was not limited to court intrigues. It also shaped her involvement in the religious controversies of her day. The Byzantine world was riven with theological disputes, particularly over the nature of Christ and the relationship between imperial authority and ecclesiastical power. Justinian, with his lawyer's mind, favored the position of orthodoxy as defined by church councils, seeking unity through doctrine. Theodora, however, was often sympathetic to those who fell outside official orthodoxy, particularly the Monophysites, who were condemned as heretics by the mainstream church. Her sympathy was not simply theological. It reflected her broader approach to power. She understood that those labeled as heretics were often politically marginalized communities, their exile or persecution creating resentment and instability. By offering them protection, she not only asserted her independence from Justinian's policy, but also cultivated loyalty among groups otherwise hostile to the empire. Her palace became a refuge for exiled clergy, and her influence shielded those who would otherwise have been silenced. This created tension between her and Justinian, though it did not fracture their partnership. Rather, it highlighted their complementary approaches. Justinian sought order through law and uniformity. Theodora sought stability through inclusion and pragmatism. Together, their differing instincts created a dynamic equilibrium in imperial policy. Theodora's willingness to confront the Church also reflected her understanding of faith as inseparable from politics. In Byzantium, doctrine was not merely a matter of belief. It was a tool of unity or division, capable of shaping loyalty across provinces. By inserting herself into theological disputes, she was not stepping beyond her role, but rather engaging directly with one of the central instruments of imperial authority. Her blend of reform and ruthlessness gave her a unique legacy. To her supporters, she was a visionary who used her power to temper the harshness of empire with compassion. To her detractors, she was an ambitious woman who wielded power to boldly, unafraid to silence enemies and defy tradition. Both views capture elements of her reign, but neither alone suffices. Her life was not a tale of mercy or severity, but of both, interwoven to create a political style that preserved her influence. Theodora must have known that her power rested on fragile ground. In a world dominated by men, where history often erased the contributions of women, she faced the constant possibility of being dismissed as a consort rather than remembered as a co-ruler. Yet her decisions, some compassionate, others merciless, ensured that her presence could not be ignored. She did not simply accompany Justinian. She shaped the empire alongside him. The unresolved question for history is whether Theodora's ruthlessness was necessary or excessive. Did her severity toward rivals preserve the empire, or did it reflect a darker side of power unchecked? In the silence of the palace, behind the glittering mosaics and towering domes, did she ever weigh the cost of her choices against the reforms she championed? The Byzantine Empire in the 6th century was never truly at peace. Its position at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa made it a nexus of trade, culture, and conflict. To the east loomed the powerful Sassanid Persian Empire, Byzantium's great rival for dominance in the region. To the west and south stretched territories contested by barbarian kingdoms, shifting alliances, and the fading shadow of Rome's old borders. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now a fractured arena where Byzantium sought to reclaim influence. In this turbulent world, diplomacy was as vital as armies, and it was here that Theodora left her quiet but significant mark. From the start of her reign, Theodora demonstrated an unusual aptitude for diplomacy. She was not a formal envoy nor a general at the head of legions, yet her voice carried weight in Justinian's councils. Where Justinian often leaned toward legal frameworks and military solutions, Theodora emphasized negotiation, subtle influence, and the careful management of human relationships. In the Byzantine worldview, the empress was not expected to engage in foreign affairs. Yet Theodora did so with determination, shaping policies in ways that often softened the edges of Justinian's ambition. The long-standing rivalry between Byzantium and Persia was marked by cycles of war, uneasy truces, and costly treaties. While Justinian envisioned bold campaigns to assert dominance, Theodora often pressed for restraint, emphasizing the expense of prolonged conflict and the strain it placed on Constantinople's already burdened population. Sources suggest that she encouraged envoys who sought compromise, supported peace talks when they arose, and maintained correspondence with influential figures within the Persian court. Her perspective reflected both pragmatism and empathy. She recognized that war destroyed not only armies, but also households, and she sought ways to preserve stability without constant bloodshed. Theodora's approach to diplomacy was not limited to Persia. She also paid close attention to the empire's western frontiers, where Gothic and Vandal kingdoms contested Rome's old territories. These conflicts, particularly in Italy and North Africa, were central to Justinian's grand vision of imperial restoration. Yet, they demanded enormous resources, straining both the treasury and the military. Theodora's role here was more delicate. While she could not prevent Justinian's campaigns, she worked to manage their diplomatic fallout. When rival rulers sought negotiation or exiled leaders appealed for refuge, it was often Theodora who received them, offering protection or counsel. Her palace became a quiet center of informal diplomacy, where personal connections could achieve what armies could not. One of the more striking examples of her diplomatic instinct was her support for, while Justinian's policies often dealt in treaties and borders, Theodora recognized the human dimensions of power, the widows of kings, the children of fallen rulers, the envoys whose positions left them vulnerable to shifts in allegiance. She extended protection to some of these figures, weaving networks of loyalty that extended beyond official treaties. In this way, she positioned herself as a patroness of the displaced, quietly reinforcing Byzantium's moral authority while strengthening her own influence. Religion, too, played a central role in foreign affairs. And here, Theodora's interventions were particularly bold. The disputes between Chalcedonian orthodoxy and Monophysite belief did not stop at Byzantium's borders. They shaped alliances with neighboring kingdoms, influenced rebellions, and fueled the politics of provinces as far as Egypt and Syria. Theodora's sympathy for Monophysites placed her in tension with Justinian's official policies, yet it also gave her unique leverage in regions where Chalcedonian authority was resented. By offering protection to exiled Monophysite clergy and maintaining ties with sympathetic communities, she created a parallel channel of diplomacy that balanced Justinian's more rigid orthodoxy. This duality, Justinian uniformity paired with Theodora's inclusiveness, allowed Byzantium to maintain a measure of influence in areas where religious divisions might otherwise have severed ties completely. Her diplomatic strategies reflected a broader philosophy that empire was not only sustained by armies and laws, but also by relationships, trust, and the ability to read the shifting tides of human ambition. She understood that treaties signed in ink could be undone by a single betrayal, but alliances nurtured through compassion, patronage, and careful listening might endure even when politics shifted. Still, her influence in foreign affairs raised unresolved questions. Was her emphasis on negotiation a necessary balance to Justinian's ambition, or did it at times restrain the empire from achieving greater dominance? Did her protection of religious dissidents strengthen imperial stability, or did it create fractures that later weakened unity? These questions linger unresolved, inviting us to consider the fragile balance between diplomacy and power in an age of constant tension. Diplomacy in Byzantium was rarely straightforward. Treaties could be signed one day and broken the next, and alliances often rested on fragile personal ties rather than lasting institutions. Theodora, with her sensitivity to human motives and her ability to read the undercurrents of power, became a critical figure in these delicate negotiations. While she rarely appeared as the formal face of diplomacy, her hand can be traced in many of the empire's most subtle maneuvers. One of the most vivid examples of her diplomatic instinct was her treatment of exiles. Constantinople was a magnet for displaced rulers, fallen generals, and envoys whose fortunes had turned against them. For some, the Byzantine court was a place of humiliation, where they were paraded as symbols of imperial triumph. For others, it became a refuge. Theodora leaned toward the latter view, recognizing that protecting displaced leaders could turn them into long-term assets. By showing generosity to those who had lost power, she created bonds of loyalty that could serve Byzantium in the future. Among the most notable of these cases was her relationship with the daughter of Theodoric the Great and regent of the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. Amalasuntha was a ruler caught in the cross-currents of Gothic politics, facing hostility from her own nobles while seeking Byzantine support. Theodora, recognizing in her a fellow woman navigating a male-dominated political world, offered sympathy and informal backing. Their relationship was more than political, it was personal, shaped by mutual understanding of the burdens and vulnerabilities of female rulers. In an age that expected women to remain silent, through this bond, Theodora sought to shape Justinian's Italian policy. Justinian's ambitions to reconquer Italy were already in motion, but Theodora's support for Amalasuntha helped justify Byzantine intervention as both political necessity and moral duty. Though Amalasuntha's eventual fate was tragic, murdered by her Gothic rivals, Theodora's involvement underscores her unique role in weaving together personal alliances with imperial strategy. In Africa, too, Theodora left her imprint on diplomacy. After Justinian's general Belisarius defeated the Vandals in North Africa, Byzantine rule had to be established over a population long accustomed to independence. Religious tensions complicated the matter. The Vandals had favored Arian Christianity, leaving a legacy of division between Arian and Chalcedonian communities. Here, Theodora's religious sympathies again shaped policy. She advocated protection for minority groups, encouraging tolerance where uniformity might have provoked rebellion. Her interventions helped soften the harsh edges of imperial rule, reminding governors that governance required more than military occupation. It demanded careful stewardship of diverse communities. Her handling of foreign envoys also reflected her instinct for diplomacy. Accounts describe her receiving ambassadors with dignity, her presence adding weight to negotiations. Unlike some empresses who remained behind the curtain of ritual, Theodora engaged directly, questioning envoys, listening to grievances, and offering reassurances. To foreign eyes, her involvement conveyed both strength and sophistication, signaling that Byzantium was governed not only by Justinian, but also by a formidable partner whose voice carried equal significance. Religious diplomacy remained a central theme of her foreign engagement. The Monophysite controversy, so divisive within the empire, was equally significant in relations with neighboring powers. Egypt and Syria, key provinces for trade and grain supply, were home to large Monophysite populations. By offering protection to exiled clergy and maintaining correspondence with their followers, Theodora created channels of communication that Justinian's policies often closed. This parallel diplomacy did not always align with imperial orthodoxy, but it gave Byzantium a flexible hand in managing restive provinces and negotiating with local leaders. Theodora's diplomatic strategies reveal her ability to think beyond the immediate demands of politics. She understood that empire was not sustained by conquest alone, but also by trust, loyalty, and human connection. Her protection of exiles, her empathy for fellow rulers, and her insistence on tolerance in religious disputes built a foundation of relationships that outlived single campaigns or treaties. Yet this approach also raised questions. Did her reliance on personal bonds risk making imperial policy too dependent on individual loyalties? Could her sympathy for exiles and dissidents, while noble, undermine the consistency of Justinian's authority? The Byzantine court itself was divided on these matters, some praising her wisdom, while others condemned her as meddling in affairs beyond her place in the quiet spaces of her palace. Theodora must have considered these tensions. She knew that her role was unconventional, that her interventions might one day be criticized as overreach. Yet she persisted, guided by the conviction that diplomacy was as much about humanity as strategy, and that compassion could, at times, serve as a tool of power more enduring than armies. The stage was thus set for the next phase of her influence, not merely offering refuge or advice, but shaping the empire's very image abroad. For if diplomacy was about perception, how would Theodora craft Byzantium's image in the eyes of the wider world? Diplomacy in Byzantium was not only about treaties and armies, it was about image. From the resplendent ceremonies of the Great Palace to the letters carried by envoys, Byzantium projected itself as the center of the civilized world. Every foreign delegation that entered Constantinople was confronted with overwhelming symbols, gleaming mosaics, golden thrones that moved by hidden machinery, lions that roared with mechanical precision, and processions that seemed to dissolve the line between earthly court and heavenly kingdom. At the heart of this spectacle stood Justinian and Theodora. The emperor embodied Roman law and order, but Theodora added a different kind of weight. She represented continuity, compassion, and formidable intellect. To foreign eyes, she was not a silent consort, but a ruler in her own right. When envoys were received in Constantinople, her presence robed in purple, crowned with jewels. Her gaze, steady and commanding, spoke volumes about the empire's sophistication and balance of power. Byzantium was not a land where women were hidden or voiceless. Here, a woman shared the throne of the greatest Christian empire on earth. Theodora skillfully used this image in the realm of religion, where diplomacy often blurred into propaganda. Justinian's policy leaned toward enforcing religious uniformity, but Theodora presented a softer face. She sheltered exiled bishops, maintained correspondence with Monophysite leaders in Syria and Egypt, and assured them that the empire had not forgotten their grievances. To outsiders, this dual approach created a sense of Byzantine flexibility: hard power on one side, soft persuasion on the other. Religious diplomacy also shaped Byzantium's relations with rival powers. In Ethiopia and Nubia, kingdoms long tied to Christian faith but distant from Constantinople, Theodora's efforts carried particular weight. Missionaries and letters conveyed not only theological arguments, but also the image of an empress deeply concerned for the spiritual lives of distant peoples. Some accounts even suggest that Theodora personally influenced which bishops were sent to these regions, ensuring that Monophysite sympathies were not crushed by Chalcedonian dominance. If true, her influence reached far beyond the empire's borders, casting Byzantium as the protector of diverse Christian traditions. Her ability to inspire loyalty extended to foreign queens and female leaders. Amalasuntha in Italy was one such example. But there were others, distant figures, who recognized in Theodora a rare kind of solidarity across borders. In a world where most courts treated women as pawns in dynastic marriages, Byzantium under Theodora projected a different message, that a woman could stand as equal partner in rule, commanding armies, shaping treaties, and shaping the destiny of nations. This image was carefully reinforced through art and ritual. In the famous mosaics of Ravenna, Theodora is depicted not as a background figure, but as a sovereign in her own right, holding the Eucharistic chalice framed by attendants. Her authority, radiating through the glittering tesserae to Western visitors, the sight of her likeness in Italian churches proclaimed her influence as vividly as any army. Diplomacy was thus not only words and treaties, but stone, glass, and ritual, embedding Byzantium's image in the very fabric of conquered lands. Theodora's interventions, however, carried long-term consequences. By protecting Monophysites and offering them a degree of legitimacy, she deepened divisions within the Christian world. What she saw as compassionate statesmanship could also be interpreted as undermining imperial unity. After her death, Justinian would pursue a harsher line, but the seeds of Theodora's diplomacy lingered, shaping how provinces like Egypt viewed Constantinople not only as a master to obey, but also as a patron that could, at times, understand. To foreign courts, her legacy was equally complex. Some admired her as a model of wisdom and grace. Others whispered that she was manipulative, her influence too strong for comfort. Yet, in either case, Byzantium's image had changed. It was no longer only the empire of Justinian, conqueror and lawgiver, but also of Theodora, mediator and protector. Together, they embodied two halves of imperial authority, force and persuasion, order and compassion. In the end, Theodora's role in foreign affairs cannot be measured solely by treaties signed or lands won. Her influence lay in the subtler realm of perception. She made exiles feel heard, foreign queens feel seen, and distant Christians feel remembered. She humanized the grandeur of Byzantium without diminishing its power. In a world where image was as potent as armies, this was no small achievement, as Byzantium projected itself to the world. Theodora ensured that it was remembered not only for conquest, but also for empathy. And in doing so, she secured her place not just in the empire's internal struggles, but in the wider story of the Mediterranean and beyond. When you imagine France in the mid-16th century, you may first think of glittering courts, extravagant banquets, and the refined splendor of Renaissance palaces. Yet, beneath the surface of elegance lay a fragile society, pulled apart by forces that threatened to undo centuries of royal authority. Catherine de' Medici, the Italian-born queen, who would become one of the most enigmatic figures in French history, entered this landscape at a time when unity was already beginning to fray. The heart of the matter was religion. France had long been a deeply Catholic kingdom, tied to Rome both spiritually and politically. The Church provided not only ritual and guidance, but also wealth, land, and influence that shaped the daily lives of peasants, nobles, and kings alike. Yet, by the 1520s and 1530s, the ideas of the Protestant Reformation began to spread across Europe, and France was no exception. French men and women, disillusioned with church corruption and attracted to new theological arguments, began to embrace the teachings of reformers such as John Calvin. These converts became known as Huguenots, and their numbers, though modest at first, steadily grew. For Catherine, the challenge was not only theological, but also political. Every Huguenot convert represented more than a personal change of belief. It represented a potential shift in loyalty. Nobles who adopted Protestantism could gather followers, arm themselves with a religious cause, and challenge the authority of the crown. Whole towns could lean toward Protestant practices, disrupting traditional ties to local bishops or monasteries. What might look, at first glance, like a private matter of faith became, in practice, a network of rival allegiances across the kingdom. The geography of France itself made matters worse. The kingdom was large and diverse, stretching from the northern plains to the Mediterranean coasts, each region with its own customs, dialects, and loyalties. In Normandy, artisans and merchants showed interest in Protestant teachings. In the south, especially in Languedoc, reformist preachers found eager audiences. Meanwhile, Paris remained staunchly Catholic, a stronghold of orthodoxy where dissent was treated with suspicion and violence. This uneven map of belief created a patchwork of identities, making the work of any monarch or regent all the more difficult. Catherine de' Medici entered the French court not as a native daughter, but as an outsider. Born into the powerful Medici family of Florence, she was married to Henry, the second son of King Francis I, as part of a broader diplomatic alliance. Her marriage, at first, did not promise her much influence. She was Italian, relatively poor compared to other royal brides, and for many years overshadowed by her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Yet fate altered her role dramatically. When Henry's elder brother died young, Henry became the heir. And when Francis I died, Henry ascended to the throne as Henry II of France, with Catherine as his queen. Her position was secured, but her challenges were immense. The court itself was divided, with powerful, noble families vying for influence. The Guise family, staunchly Catholic and militarily capable, wielded enormous power. On the other side, noble houses such as the Bourbons were more sympathetic to Protestant reform. Catherine, as queen, was expected to balance these forces. Yet her foreign origins made her suspect in the eyes of many French courtiers. Some viewed her as a meddling Italian, others as a potential agent of papal influence, and others still as a woman too ambitious for her proper station. The death of Henry II in 1559 placed Catherine in an even more precarious position. A jousting accident claimed his life, leaving their 15-year-old son, Francis II, on the throne. Catherine, now Queen Mother, found herself thrust into a role she had not expected, regent and protector of her children's fragile inheritance. The problem was that Francis II was weak in health and temperament. heavily influenced by his young wife, Mary, Queen of Scots, and by the powerful Guy's family. Catherine had little direct authority, yet she was expected to hold together a kingdom already splitting at the seams. The religious question grew more urgent with every passing year. Huguenots were no longer a scattered minority, but an organized force. They held secret meetings, printed pamphlets, and developed networks that crossed regional and social boundaries. At the same time, Catholic authorities pushed back with trials, executions, and bans on heretical books. Violence simmered beneath the surface, occasionally breaking out into riots or skirmishes. Sermons or public gatherings turned hostile. Catherine, pragmatic to her core, saw that the extremes on both sides threatened not only peace but the monarchy itself. What made her dilemma so acute was the absence of a clear solution. To favor the Catholics risked driving the Huguenots into open rebellion. To favor the Huguenots risked alienating the church and most of the nobility. To choose neutrality risked angering both sides. Catherine understood that the monarchy was not merely an abstract symbol, it was a fragile institution, dependent on loyalty, perception, and ritual. If the crown lost the ability to appear as the guardian of all subjects, then its power would unravel. In this environment, Catherine's strategies leaned toward mediation. She sought compromise where possible, urging tolerance when others demanded suppression. She arranged colloquies, or formal debates, between Catholic and Protestant theologians, hoping that dialogue might ease tensions. She encouraged her sons, as kings, to project authority, not through absolute partisanship, but through careful balancing. Her methods were cautious, pragmatic, and sometimes frustratingly slow, but they reflected her conviction that survival depended on patience rather than rash decisions. At the same time, Catherine relied heavily on ceremony and spectacle. She understood that monarchy was as much about appearances as decrees. Royal entries into cities, processions, and courtly displays reinforced the image of a strong, united crown. Even as divisions deepened, Catherine ensured that the monarchy maintained a visible presence. By surrounding herself and her children with elaborate rituals, she reminded subjects that the crown was still the center of the kingdom's life, no matter what disputes raged around it. Yet for all her efforts, peace remained fragile. Beneath the gilded masks of ceremony, ordinary people were choosing sides. A merchant in Rouen might shelter Protestant pamphleteers. A nobleman in the Loire Valley might secretly finance reformist preachers. A parish priest in Paris might denounce Protestant sympathizers with fiery sermons. Catherine could control the court. She could influence her sons. But she could not control the tide of religious conviction that was sweeping across her kingdom in those early years of her regency. Catherine de' Medici faced a dilemma that no monarch would envy: how to hold together a kingdom where faith had become sharper than swords, and where loyalty to God threatened to eclipse loyalty to the crown. Her balancing act was delicate, her strategies cautious, but the forces at work were vast and uncontrollable. And so the question remained: could a queen mother, foreign by birth and doubted by many, preserve the fragile peace of France, or would the pressures of religion and politics drive the kingdom into inevitable conflict? Catherine's early years as regent were marked by careful calculation, restraint, and a determined effort to maintain balance between Catholics and Protestants. Yet, as the 1560s unfolded, the very forces she sought to manage began to push beyond compromise. The Kingdom of France, diverse, restless, and bound by competing loyalties, was moving toward open confrontation. One of Catherine's earliest attempts at preserving unity came in the form of organized debates. In 1561, she oversaw the Colloquy of Poissy, a formal gathering of Catholic and Protestant theologians. Her goal was not to impose a settlement, but to encourage dialogue, hoping that intellectual discussion might soften hostility. For a time, the spectacle gave the appearance of progress. Protestant leaders, including Theodora Byzantine, stood before Catholic cardinals and bishops, presenting their case for reform with eloquence and conviction. Catherine, seated with regal poise, emphasized the importance of mutual understanding, but dialogue had its limits. The debates at Poissy revealed not a path toward unity, but the depth of division. Fundamental disagreements over theology, particularly the nature of the Eucharist, proved impossible to bridge. For Catholic authorities, Protestant teachings bordered on blasphemy. For Protestants, Catholic insistence on ritual and papal authority seemed irredeemably corrupt. When the colloquy ended, no resolution had been reached, and the atmosphere of suspicion only deepened. Catherine turned next to edicts of toleration, measures intended to give Protestants limited freedoms while preserving Catholic predominance. The most notable was the Edict of Saint-Germain in 1562, which permitted Huguenots to worship publicly outside city walls and privately within homes. For Catherine, this was a pragmatic attempt to reduce tensions by recognizing a reality that could no longer be ignored. Protestants were too numerous to suppress entirely. The edict did not grant equality, but it offered breathing space to many Catholics. However, the edict was intolerable. For centuries, France had been identified as the eldest daughter of the Church, a kingdom bound to Catholic tradition. To legalize even limited Protestant worship seemed like betrayal. Rumors spread that the crown had been captured by heresy, manipulated by a foreign-born queen who did not share French devotion to the true faith. The Guise family, always watchful for opportunities, capitalized on these fears. The breaking point came at Vassy in March 1562. Francis, Duke of Guise, encountered a Protestant congregation worshipping in a barn. His soldiers attacked, killing dozens of men, women, and children. News of the massacre spread rapidly, igniting outrage among Huguenots and stiffening Catholic resolve. What had been simmering tensions now erupted into violence that could not be contained by edicts or debates. The French wars of religion had begun. Catherine found herself in an impossible position. As regent for her son Charles IX, she was expected to safeguard the unity of the kingdom. Yet the massacre at Vassy had set in motion a cycle of retaliation. Huguenot leaders, including Louis, Prince of Conde, and Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, raised armies in defense of their faith. Catholic forces, galvanized by the Guise, prepared to crush what they saw as rebellion. France was no longer a kingdom of debates and edicts. It had become a battlefield. The wars that followed were brutal in their detail. Cities were besieged, villages plundered, churches desecrated. Ordinary people, who only months earlier had gone about their daily lives, found themselves caught between rival armies. Farmers lost their harvests to soldiers who requisitioned supplies. Townspeople feared raids that could come from either side. For many, survival meant hiding, fleeing, or making quiet compromises with whichever faction held local power. The lofty theological disputes of Paris or Geneva translated for peasants and artisans into hunger, loss, and fear. Catherine, desperate to regain control, sought again to negotiate peace. In 1563, the Edict of Amboise brought a temporary halt to fighting. It restricted Protestant worship to nobles, estates, and certain towns, narrowing the freedoms granted in the earlier edict. The compromise reflected Catherine's style, not outright repression, not full acceptance, but a middle path intended to calm both sides. Yet peace was fragile. Neither Catholics nor Huguenots felt satisfied, and armed bands continued to clash despite official decrees. The deeper problem was that religion had become inseparable from politics. To be Catholic or Protestant was not merely a matter of belief, was a marker of loyalty, identity, and ambition. Noble families used religious alignment to strengthen their own positions, forging alliances that could challenge royal authority. International powers also entered the picture. Protestant leaders in France looked to England or German princes for support, while Catholic factions sought aid from Spain or the papacy. Catherine's kingdom was not isolated. It was a node in a wider web of European conflict. Her task as regent grew heavier with every passing year. Charles IX, though king, was still a boy when the wars began. Catherine remained the true authority, counseling patience, urging compromise, and navigating between factions that accused her alternately of weakness, duplicity, or tyranny. She hosted negotiations, issued proclamations, and traveled the kingdom with her children, hoping to display royal presence as a force for unity. But the underlying forces, the fervor of faith, the ambitions of nobles. By the mid-1560s, it was clear that France was not heading toward reconciliation, but deeper division. Each peace edict brought only temporary respite. Each outbreak of violence left scars that hardened loyalties. The crown, once the unquestioned center of authority, appeared weaker with each compromise. Catherine's role, though skillful, seemed less like that of a ruler guiding events and more like a caretaker managing crises she could not resolve. And so the question pressed harder with each passing year. Could Catherine's cautious balancing act hold together a kingdom tearing itself apart? Was France destined to slip into cycles of bloodshed that no monarch, however determined, could truly stop? By the late 1560s, Catherine de' Medici had spent nearly a decade trying to balance the competing forces of Catholic and Protestant within France. She had arranged debates, issued edicts of tolerance, and mediated between noble factions. But each measure seemed to buy only fleeting peace. The deeper divisions of faith and loyalty ran too deep, and they were soon to erupt into violence on a scale that Catherine, despite her caution and pragmatism, could not contain. The early 1570s brought a fragile hope for reconciliation. Catherine, ever the political strategist, sought to unite the kingdom through marriage diplomacy. Her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, was to wed Henry of Navarre, a leading Protestant noble and future King of France. The marriage, celebrated in Paris in August 1572, was intended as a symbol of unity. Catholic princess and Protestant prince bound together under the watchful gaze of the crown. Foreign envoys and noble families gathered in the capital, filling its streets with celebration and cautious optimism. But the optimism was short-lived. Paris was a staunchly Catholic city, and many citizens viewed the presence of Huguenot leaders with suspicion, even hostility. The wedding, far from healing wounds, seemed to deepen resentments. Rumors circulated of Protestant plots to seize control of the court. Tensions thickened, and Catherine herself faced accusations of being too indulgent toward her Protestant subjects. The breaking point came only days after the wedding, in the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. In the early hours of August 24th, violence erupted in Paris. Protestant leaders who had gathered in the city for the wedding were targeted in a wave of assassinations. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, one of the most prominent Huguenot commanders, was among the first to be struck down. As news spread, mobs poured into the streets, slaughtering Protestants with brutal efficiency. Houses were raided, families torn apart, bodies left in the gutters. The violence did not remain confined to Paris. It spread to other towns and cities, unleashing a chain of massacres that left thousands dead across the kingdom. Catherine's role in the massacre has long been debated. Some sources suggest she orchestrated the killings, fearing Protestant influence over her son, Charles IX. Others argue she was swept up in forces beyond her control, pressured by Catholic hardliners and the fury of the Parisian mob. What seems clear is that she neither prevented nor condemned the violence with decisive force. The Queen, who had once sought compromise and balance, was now indelibly linked to one of the darkest chapters in France's history. In the aftermath, the fragile credibility of the crown suffered further. Protestants who survived fled into exile or retreated into fortified towns. Trust in royal promises evaporated. Each new edict of tolerance was met with skepticism, each attempt at peace undermined by memories of betrayal. The wars of religion, which had already scarred the kingdom, now hardened into cycles of mistrust and vengeance that would last for decades. For Catherine, the years that followed were consumed by efforts to salvage what remained of royal authority. She continued to act as mediator, negotiating treaties, arranging marriages, and traveling the kingdom with her children in hopes of displaying unity. Yet the monarchy's power was increasingly limited. Nobles wielded private armies, towns declared loyalties independent of the crown, and foreign powers, Spain, England, the papacy, continued to influence France's fate from beyond its borders. Catherine's reputation, shaped by both her actions and her enemies, grew darker. To some, she became a symbol of ruthlessness, the Italian queen who poisoned, plotted, and manipulated with cold precision. Tales of her supposed reliance on astrologers and alchemists, though exaggerated, added to her mystique. To others, she was simply a pragmatist, a woman who had tried to preserve unity in an impossible situation, making choices that reflected necessity rather than malice. Yet her true legacy lies somewhere in between. Catherine did not create the divisions of her kingdom, nor could she resolve them. She was a foreign-born queen mother thrust into power during one of the most turbulent eras in French history. Her policies of tolerance were ahead of their time, her balancing act both remarkable and insufficient. The massacre of 1572 stained her name. Yet, it also revealed the limits of royal authority in an age when religious passion overwhelmed political calculation. By the time of her death in 1589, Catherine had outlived 3 of her sons who wore the French crown. The kingdom she had labored to preserve was still fractured, still bleeding from the wars of religion. And yet, through her persistence, the monarchy itself survived. Her son, Henry III, would fall, but Henry of Navarre, the very Protestant prince she had once welcomed into her family, would ultimately ascend the throne as Henry IV, bringing a measure of stability to a war-torn land. In reflecting on Catherine's role, one must ask, was she the cause of France's turmoil, or merely its caretaker during a storm too vast for any single ruler to master? Her legacy resists simple answers. What remains clear is that she embodied the paradox of power in a divided age, cautious, sometimes ruthless, and always burdened with choices that could never satisfy all. And so, as history remembers her, sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with reluctant respect, we are left with the enduring question: did Catherine de' Medici preserve the crown of France? Or did her compromises and failures hasten the kingdom's descent into chaos? And so, we come to the end of Theodora's long journey. From her early life in hardship to her rise beside Justinian, and finally to her quiet final years, her story has unfolded, not in haste, but in patient detail. Theodora's life is a reminder that history is not only battles and victories, but also survival, resilience, and choices made in silence behind the walls of power. Her legacy, carried through centuries of retelling, still lingers in the margins of the Byzantine world. Here, at Boring Past Times, we leave her story at rest. Another life lived, another thread woven into the fabric of history. Until next time, may you drift into quiet sleep, carrying with you the stillness of the past.